two earlier films on the Pictish symbol stones, we saw that Pictish history and culture has been the source of considerable confusion and controversy.
The Picts of Scotland have always been ghosts. Their legacy is nothing but silent, haunting stones scattered across the highlands. Historians had to guess, spinning wild tales that they were exotic warriors from Eastern Europe. But the thing nobody tells you is, that was all a fantasy. Scientists just pulled the actual DNA from Pictish graves, and the results are staggering. The genetic code doesn't just tell us who they were, it points to a massive paradox in Scottish history and proves their entire social structure was the opposite of what we thought. Vanished from history. For centuries, the Romans built walls to keep them out. They were the Picti, the painted people of ancient Scotland, a tribe of fierce warriors who defied an empire. But then, they vanished. They left behind hundreds of haunting stone monuments carved with bizarre symbols that no one can read, but not a single written word of their own. Historians thought they were exotic invaders from the Black Sea. But a new genetic study just read their DNA, and the truth is so much stranger. It doesn't just rewrite their story, it rewrites the story of Scotland itself. To understand how big this discovery is, you first have to understand the mystery. The Picts were, to put it mildly, the original enigma of the British Isles. They enter the history books in the late 3rd century AD, and they enter as the enemy. Roman writers called them Picti, which means the painted people. It's believed they either tattooed their bodies or covered themselves in blue-woad paint before heading into a conflict. They were the barbarians of the north, the ones who lived beyond the mighty walls of Hadrian and Antoninus. They were so formidable that the most powerful empire in the world decided it was easier to build a massive coast-to-coast stone barrier stretching 73 miles than to try and conquer them. For over 500 years, the Picts dominated the lands north of the Forth and Clyde, what is today northern and eastern Scotland. They weren't just a scattered bunch of tribes, they were organized. They formed powerful kingdoms, built impressive forts on hilltops, and created some of the most stunning and bizarre art in European history. This is their true legacy. This is the core of the mystery. All across Scotland, you can find them, the Pictish symbol stones. There are hundreds of them, and they are baffling. They are carved with incredible skill, showing intricate patterns, powerful animals like wolves, stags, eagles, and salmon. And then there are the strange geometric shapes that have baffled experts for generations. We see crescents paired with V-rods, double discs with Z-rods, and a strange, unidentifiable creature known simply as the Pictish beast. This creature, which appears more than any other, looks like a mix between a seahorse, a dolphin, and maybe even an elephant. Some have even suggested it's a water kelpie or a stylized version of the Loch Ness Monster. But here's the catch. This is all they left. This is the central problem. They wrote nothing down about themselves. No histories, no letters, no poems, no records of their kings or their beliefs. Just these silent, haunting symbols. We don't know if this was a written language, a religious code, or a way of marking family lines and territories. We simply don't know. And then, the real mystery begins. Around the 9th and 10th centuries, something changed, and it changed fast. The Picts had been in a long-term struggle with another group, the Scots of Dalriada. The Scots had come over from Ireland and settled on the west coast. A king named Kenneth MacAlpin managed to unite both peoples, forging the new kingdom of Alba, the foundation of modern Scotland. And just like that, the Picts disappear from history. Their language, a tongue we barely have any record of, vanished. Their unique culture faded. Their name was no longer used by chroniclers. It's as if an entire civilization, a people who had held off the Roman legions, just melted into thin air. This total void, no writing, a sudden disappearance, created a vacuum. And you see, nature hates a vacuum. For the next 1,000 years, historians and writers filled that void with myths. The most famous story came from a respected English scholar called the Venerable Bede. Writing in the year 731 AD, Bede claimed the Picts were not native to Britain at all. He wrote that they were foreign immigrants who had come from the distant land of Scythia, a vast region near the Black Sea, thousands of miles away. He spun a tale of them arriving in Ireland, being turned away, and then settling in northern Britain. This story stuck. People loved it. It made the Picts seem exotic, a mysterious band of warriors from the edges of the known world. Other theories popped up too. Some claimed they came from Thrace in southeastern Europe. Others said they were from mysterious, unknown islands. The one thing everyone seemed to agree on was that the Picts were foreigners. They were outsiders who arrived, dominated, and then vanished. The problem? It was all just guesswork. There was zero physical proof for any of it. For centuries, the truth of Scotland's lost tribe remained locked away, a romantic tale of mysterious origins. We had no way to check the stories, no way to know who these painted people really were. Until now. The old bones were silent, but science found a way to make them talk. Reading the Pictish blueprint. Science finally had a tool powerful enough to cut through 1,000 years of myth. Ancient DNA analysis. An international team of researchers led by scientists from Liverpool John Moores University and the University of Aberdeen decided to tackle the Pictish mystery once and for all. They weren't going to rely on old books or confusing symbols. They were going straight to the source, the Picts themselves. But this was not an easy task. To put it mildly, ancient DNA is incredibly fragile. Human remains from the Pictish era are surprisingly rare, and Scotland's damp, acidic soil is terrible for preserving the delicate genetic material. DNA, the molecule of life, breaks down over time. Finding samples that were good enough for sequencing was a massive challenge. The team focused their efforts on two key Pictish cemeteries. The first and most important was at Lundin Links in Fife, right in the heart of what was once southern Pictland. This wasn't just any burial ground, it's famous for its exceptional stone monuments and elaborate graves. The people here were buried in long cists, which are like stone-built boxes, carefully constructed to hold the remains. The care taken with these burials suggests this might have been a place for high-status individuals, the Pictish elite. The second site was at Ballantor in Easter Ross, representing the northern reach of Pictland, closer to the highlands. Together, these two sites gave the scientists a good spread across the Pictish kingdoms. The burials all dated from between the 5th and 7th centuries, the absolute peak of Pictish power. This is where the real wow factor comes in. The scientists, working in sterile labs, drilled into the densest parts of the skeletons, often the petrous bone in the inner ear, which is known to be the best preserved part of the body. They painstakingly extracted tiny fragmented amounts of genetic material. They had to filter out contamination from bacteria, from the soil, and even from the archaeologists who first uncovered the bones. From this genetic dust, they managed to do something incredible. They successfully extracted DNA from 8 different individuals, 7 from Lundin Links and 1 from Ballantor. Now, 8 might not sound like a lot, but in the world of ancient DNA, this is a gold mine. The preservation was so good that they were able to sequence 2 complete high-quality genomes, 1 from each site. Think about that. A genome is the entire genetic instruction manual for a person. They were reading the complete biological blueprint of 2 people who lived, breathed, and fought as Picts over 1,500 years ago. They also successfully examined the mitochondrial DNA from 7 of the individuals, which, as we'll see, would become incredibly important. But you see, a genome by itself doesn't tell you much. It's just a long string of letters. The real magic happens when you compare it to others. The researchers took their 2 Pictish genomes and ran them against a massive database of more than 8,300 other genomes, both ancient and modern. They compared the Picts to ancient Iron Age people from Britain, to Romans, to Anglo-Saxons, to Vikings, and to thousands of modern people living in Britain, Ireland, and all over Europe. This was the ultimate test, the moment of truth. If the old legends were true, the Pictish DNA would show a clear genetic link to ancient peoples from Eastern Europe near the Black Sea. If Bede was right, the answer would be right there in the code. The computers ran the analysis. The team waited, and when the results came back, they were completely unambiguous. When the results came back, every single one of those old myths was blown apart. A 1,000-year-old lie? The single biggest question was finally answered. Where did the Picts come from? The answer was not Scythia. It was not Thrace. It was not some mysterious faraway island. The DNA evidence proved without a shadow of a doubt that the Picts were local. They were native to the British Isles. What the scientists found was a direct, unbroken genetic link between the Picts and the Iron Age populations who had lived in Britain for generations before the Romans even arrived. We're talking about the people who built the iconic stone towers known as brochs. The people who lived in hill forts, the very people the Romans first encountered. This is a concept scientists call regional continuity. It means the Picts weren't a wave of foreign invaders who showed up and took over. They were the descendants of the original people of the land. The Pictish culture, the painted bodies, the bizarre symbols, the powerful kingdoms, wasn't something they brought with them. It was something that developed right there in northern Britain, an organic response to their environment and the constant military threat of the Roman Empire to the south. The Picts were simply the name the Romans gave to the native people they couldn't conquer. Dr. Adeline Morat, the lead author of the study, explained it clearly. The findings support a continuity between the late Iron Age and the early medieval period. The Pictish gene pool was drawn from the older local Iron Age populations, not from some far-off migration. This single fact rewrites the first chapter of Scottish history. The romantic tale of exotic warriors from the Black Sea, a story repeated for over 1,300 years, was a complete fantasy. But the thing nobody tells you is that the discovery didn't stop there. It got even crazier when they compared the ancient Pictish DNA to modern populations. This is where it gets personal for many people. The researchers looked for shared DNA between the Picts and people living today. What they found was fascinating. Modern people living in Western Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Northumbria in northern England all share more genetic similarities with the ancient Picts than people from southern England do. How can this be? The answer is the Anglo-Saxons. You see, starting in the 5th century after the Roman Empire collapsed, massive waves of Anglo-Saxon peoples migrated from mainland Europe, what is now Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark, into Britain. They settled heavily in the south and east of England. This was a huge influx of new people, and it fundamentally changed the gene pool of southern England forever. But up in the north and west, in places like Wales and western Scotland, that Anglo-Saxon migration had much less of an impact. The populations there remained more stable, carrying a much stronger signal from the original pre-Anglo-Saxon Iron Age inhabitants. And since the Picts were those original inhabitants, their genetic signature is strongest today in the very places the Anglo-Saxons didn't reach in large numbers. The lost tribe was never truly lost. Their descendants are walking around today in Glasgow, Cardiff, and Belfast. The Picts didn't vanish. They just became the Scots, the Welsh, and the Northern Irish. This was a wow factor moment, connecting a mysterious ancient people directly to millions of people alive today. But the DNA test had one more secret to reveal. It was about to bust open one of the most bizarre and long-held theories about how Pictish society actually worked. Following the mother's line. For centuries, scholars have whispered about a very strange practice among the Picts. It was a theory that, if true, would make them almost unique in European history. The idea, first hinted at by the Venerable Bede and supported by some interpretations of the Pictish king lists, was that the Picts were matrilineal. What does that mean? In a normal patrilineal society, like the Romans or frankly almost every other one, power and property pass from father to son. But in a matrilineal system, it all passes through the female line. The theory was that a Pictish king wouldn't be succeeded by his own son. He would be succeeded by his sister's son. Power would jump from uncle to nephew, all tracked through the mother. Why did anyone believe this? The Pictish king lists are a mess. They show kings with names that don't seem to be related to their predecessors' fathers. For instance, a king's name would be Brood, son of Maelchon, but the previous king might have a totally different father's name. This suggested to historians that the father's line was unimportant and that the real qualification for kingship was being related to a royal woman. This is an incredibly rare system. It would suggest that women in Pictish society held a special kind of power and importance, that lineage was only counted through them. This theory was often tied to another one, matrilocality. This is the idea that when a man and woman got married, the man would leave his village and go live with his wife's family. The women, therefore, would stay in their home community their entire lives, passing it down to their daughters. It's a fascinating, romantic idea, a society built around women. Many people were crazy about this theory. It made the Picts seem even more mysterious and unique, but it was just a theory, a guess based on reading between the lines of confusing old texts. Until now. The DNA study gave researchers a direct way to test this women stay put theory. How? By looking at a special kind of DNA called mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA. You don't get mtDNA from both parents. You only inherit it from your mother. And she got it from her mother, and so on, in an unbroken female line back through thousands of years. The logic was simple. The researchers had 7 different people from the same cemetery at Lundin Links. If the Picts were matrilocal, if the women stayed in this one community for generations, then many of the people buried there should be related on their mother's side. They should all share a few common female ancestors. Their mitochondrial DNA, therefore, should be very similar. You would expect to see a lot of repetition, a low level of diversity. The scientists ran the tests on the 7 samples. The results came back, and they were a bombshell. The mitochondrial DNA of the 7 individuals was not similar. It was highly diverse. All 7 people carried unique mutations, meaning none of them were closely related on their mother's side. This finding doesn't just poke a hole in the matrilineal theory, it shatters it. It proves the exact opposite was happening. The diversity of maternal DNA means that women were not staying put. Instead, women were moving into the Lundin Links community from other places, likely to get married. This practice is called female exogamy, marrying out, and patrilocality. The wife moves to the husband's home. To put it simply, Pictish society was likely structured just like most of its neighbors. It was patrilocal. The men stayed put and the women moved. The whole idea of a female-centered dynasty, which had been taught in history books for decades, was wrong. The DNA doesn't lie. For centuries, we believed in this exotic, female-centered society based on a few vague sentences from an old book and some confusing king lists. The DNA test, in one clean sweep, proved it was a complete myth. The wow factor here is that science could reach back 1,500 years and correct a historical mistake. But in solving this mystery, the DNA uncovered one final nagging puzzle, a geographic contradiction that just didn't seem to make any sense. But this left one final nagging puzzle, the heartland paradox. The Viking and Anglo-Saxon overwrite. This is where the story gets really, truly complex. Imagine you're a historian or maybe a geneticist. You've spent years digging through ancient graves and running DNA samples. You're trying to solve one of the oldest mysteries in history. Who were the Picts? And you find 2 puzzle pieces, 2 facts. And the problem is, these 2 facts seem to completely, totally, and absolutely contradict each other. It's a paradox that for decades nobody could solve. Let's lay them out clearly. Fact 1. The DNA. When researchers sequenced the genomes of people buried in Pictish graves, like the men at Lundin Links, they compared them to modern populations. They wanted to see who the Picts' closest living relatives were. The answer was shocking. The DNA of the ancient Picts is most similar to modern people living in Western Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Keep that in your head. The West. Fact 2. The archaeology. This is the part nobody disputes. The Pictish heartland, their main kingdoms, their most powerful forts, their religious centers, and the overwhelming majority of their famous, mesmerizing symbol stones was in the east of Scotland. We're not talking about a small difference. We're talking about the core of their entire civilization. Places like Fife, Angus, and Aberdeenshire. This was Pictland. This was their home turf. So, how is this possible? How can the Pictish genetic signature be strongest today in the West, an area that was, back then, mostly controlled by their rivals? And not just any rivals. We're talking about the Scots of Dalriada. Let's be clear about who these Scots were. They weren't from Scotland originally, they were Gaels who came across the narrow sea from Ireland. They were, for a long time, a different people with a different language, and they were often the Picts' mortal enemies. They fought brutal wars for control of the land. So why on earth would the Picts' genetic legacy be strongest in the very land of their enemies? And even more baffling, why would their DNA be weaker today in their own Eastern Heartland? The place where they lived, ruled, and died for centuries? It's a massive geographic paradox. It makes no sense, unless the answer isn't about the Picts at all. The answer, it turns out, is about what happened after them. What many researchers and historians overlooked for years is that the eastern heartland of Pictland did not exist in a vacuum. It was prime real estate. And after the Pictish period, roughly around 900 AD, that specific part of Scotland got hit by wave after wave after wave of new people. First, you had the Anglo-Saxons. After the Romans packed up and left Britain, new players entered the game. The Angles and Saxons, Germanic tribes from modern-day Germany and Denmark, established powerful kingdoms in what is now England. One of those kingdoms, Northumbria, was incredibly aggressive. It pushed north right into the Pictish lowlands. They didn't just win battles, they settled down. They brought their families, their farming, and, most importantly, their language. Old English, which would eventually, centuries later, evolve into the Scots language. This was the first wave, a significant new genetic ingredient poured into the Eastern Bowl. But the Anglo-Saxons were just the opening act. The really big one? The event that completely rewrote the genetic map of Scotland? The Vikings. Starting in the late 8th and 9th centuries, Viking raiders from Norway and Denmark saw the rich, undefended monasteries and fertile farmlands of eastern and northern Scotland as a golden opportunity. And when we say Vikings, don't picture a few longboats showing up, stealing some gold and leaving. Picture an invasion, a demographic earthquake. They hammered the east and north of Scotland, and they didn't just raid, they settled. They conquered. The northern isles of Orkney and Shetland, which had been Pictish strongholds, were completely and totally taken over by the Norse. The Pictish language there vanished. The Pictish culture was submerged. The islands didn't just become like Norway, they became an earldom of Norway. They were ruled by Scandinavian earls for hundreds of years. This massive, relentless, centuries-long influx of Scandinavian DNA effectively overwrote much of the original Pictish genetic signal in the east and the north. The people who lived there began to show a strong, dominant mix of Pictish and Norwegian ancestry. It's like pouring cup after cup of black coffee into a cup of milk. The milk is still in there, but its original signature has been fundamentally changed, diluted. Meanwhile, what was happening in the west? The west of Scotland wasn't some peaceful, untouched paradise. It had its own settlers, the Gaelic-speaking Scots from Ireland, who were busy building their kingdom of Dalriada. The Vikings raided there too. But, and this is the entire key to the mystery, the West was less impacted by the specific heavy Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian settlements that completely redefined the East. Its population, along with places like Wales and parts of Northern Ireland, remained more stable. It was geographically shielded from the main thrust of these new migrations. These western regions acted like a genetic refuge. They became a genetic museum, preserving that older Iron Age British gene pool. So here's the aha moment, the big reveal. The DNA is strong in the West, not because the Picts all packed up and moved there. The DNA is strong in the West because that's where the original Iron Age British gene pool, the exact same pool the Picts came from, was preserved the best. The modern people in the West are, in effect, the closest living relatives of the entire ancient British population, a massive group that included the Picts. The scientists weren't just looking at Pictish DNA, they were looking at ancient Britain DNA. The Picts were just one powerful, artistic, and mysterious branch of that ancient family tree. So let's talk straight. Are we missing a key detail? Is this all true? The thing is, this new evidence changes everything. For centuries, this lost people were a blank canvas for some of the wildest theories in history. Because their art was so strange, because their language disappeared. Historians in the 18th and 19th centuries argued they must be foreign invaders. They couldn't possibly be related to their neighbors. Maybe they were Scythians, fierce horsemen from the Black Sea, or maybe they were Thracians or ancient Basques. Then there was the bizarre matriarchy theory. This idea came from ancient king lists, which seemed to show that Pictish kings inherited the throne through their mothers, not their fathers. This led to all kinds of wild speculation about a magical Amazonian queendom, a society ruled by women that was totally alien to the rest of Europe. The DNA slams the door shut on all of this. First, the exotic invader theory. The DNA is crystal clear. The Picts were not from the Black Sea, Thrace, or anywhere else. They were 100% native. They were the direct descendants of the Iron Age people who had lived in Britain for millennia. They were, quite simply, the original people of the land. Second, the bizarre matriarchy. While their succession rules might have been unique and probably very practical for building alliances, the DNA shows no evidence of a society where women were genetically isolated. The men and women in the graves were from the same local gene pool. It was probably a practical system, not a fantasy novel. The story of the Picts, those painted people of ancient Scotland, unfolds not over a few centuries, but over 2 millennia. For generations, we've been told they were a mysterious, lost tribe, a bizarre footnote in history that was simply wiped out. But that entire narrative is wrong. They were not a lost tribe. They were the native people of northern Britain, the original inhabitants. And they built a culture that was, to put it mildly, incredible. Think about this. They faced the Roman Empire at its absolute peak. They stared down the legions, the most disciplined and powerful army on earth, and fought them to a complete standstill. The Romans, the conquerors of Gaul, of Egypt, of the known world, couldn't subdue them. In fact, the Romans gave up. They built Hadrian's Wall and then the Antonine Wall, vast fortifications designed not to conquer the Picts, but simply to contain them. The Picts were the barbarians the empire could not break. For centuries, they thrived. They weren't just wild warriors, they were sophisticated farmers, master builders, and incredible artists. They built imposing hilltop forts that dominated the landscape. They crafted exquisite jewelry and metalwork, silver chains and intricate brooches that rival anything found elsewhere in Europe. And, most famously, they carved their symbols into massive standing stones. We still can't decipher them. The crescent and V-rod, the double disc, the strange stylized animals. They are a language we've completely forgotten, a silent testament to a complex society. And then they didn't vanish. They just changed. They didn't disappear. They adapted. They were too smart, too resilient to just be erased. But they faced an impossible situation, a triple threat. From the west came the Scots of Dalriada, their old rivals. From the south, the ambitious Anglo-Saxons pushed relentlessly north. And from the north and east came the fury of the Vikings, raining fire and steel down on their coasts. The Pictish world was caught in a vice, so they made a choice. They merged. In one of the most brilliant political moves of the Dark Ages, they joined with their old rivals, the Scots. Through a combination of political marriage, dynasty, and shared threat, the Pictish kingdom and the Scottish kingdom became one. This wasn't a conquest. It was a union. Together they forged a new unified kingdom to fight their common enemies. They called it the Kingdom of Alba. This was the birth of medieval Scotland. Their old life faded, but it wasn't destroyed. They married Anglo-Saxons. They married Vikings, creating the fierce Norse Gaels. Their ancient language was slowly replaced by the Gaelic of the New Court and later by Scots. Their very name was forgotten, replaced by the new identity of Scots. But their blood, their DNA, their genes endured. Picts were never lost, just transformed. It makes you wonder, what ancient secrets are hiding in your DNA? Let us know what you think below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more mysteries solved.